I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I am unfortunately not joined here by my co-host, Jaron, today, as we had a bit of an issue in terms of him forgetting his microphone as he's staying elsewhere tonight. He was able to watch the game and everything, but just kind of a mishap on our part. But nonetheless, I still got you guys covered, of course. Today, we are going to be covering the Mavericks' 129-114 victory over the Houston Rockets. Probably one of the more nonchalant wins of the Mavericks season. But the Mavericks are, ever so quietly, because probably 4 out of these 5 games, you can argue or make an argument that the Mavericks could have easily lost it, or even if they did win, the way in which they won was not defiant, and it was not emblematic of a team on a 5-game win streak that I guess you would think of stereotypically, right? But this game, like the Mavericks, the Rockets do have the worst record in the league, but the Mavericks, to say the very least, they came out and took care of business, and they needed a type of win like this. I don't really feel like this Mavericks team has had a lot of take care of business wins where there's just no sweat from start to finish. They were at home, of course, so that always bodes well for them, as their home record, is tenfold better than their road record, which is, honestly atrocious, but that may have been an aiding factor. But as we approach the new year, it was nice for the Mavericks to take care of business and what could have easily been a trap game, especially with the amount of injuries the Mavericks had right now. Anytime that they get a win like this amidst, our plethora of our best 3 defenders being out in Josh Green, Maxi Kleber, and Dorian Finney-Smith, this is kind of a rough stretch that we're going through with, particularly with Green. Maxi, obviously, with the hamstring tear, is going to be out probably about another 5 weeks, but Green and Finney-Smith, they're both getting reevaluated in like a week here. And the Mavericks are kind of having to get hokey with some of these lineups and their rotations. I'll get into that a little bit in this podcast today. So the fact that they were able to basically kind of tread water, or honestly, not just tread water, but excel during this stretch, just in terms of the win column. At the end of the day, the Mavericks can play however they play during the game, but a win is a win, right? So it's been really cool to see them win 5 games, all in the most kind of obscure fashions and, bad wins, quote unquote. But you take it at the end of the day. And this was like the first win out of this 5-game win streak, like I said, where, albeit against a severely, brittle and fragile young Rockets team that couldn't play defense. If they had every single defensive boost on 2K, this team still couldn't play transition defense or defense in the half court for that matter. But it's still cool to see the Mavericks take care of business, right? And it was needed. Luka Doncic, like I said, just to talk about, the nonchalantness short of this game. I don't know if that's actually a word, but I'm going to say it anyways. Luka Doncic had probably one of the most effortless 35-point triple-doubles I think I'd ever seen, or just triple-doubles in general. I mean, he had just countless outlet passes in transition where the Rockets, just kind of failed to get back. But, they were just spot on. The type passes where it's like, wow, like this guy is really toying with this team right now, chucking it full court from end to end to Davis Bertans a couple times. Spencer Dinwiddie, Dwight Powell, I think, was recipient of one of those passes. Luka, he was just playing around. Anytime he's kind of just getting a rebound and throwing an outlet pass immediately, like multiple times over the course of a game, it just truly shows how easy and rudimentary these processes are for him, especially against a team as bad as at defense as the Rockets. There was one play in the fourth quarter where I believe it was Dwight got hit really hard in, his abdominal area by Tari Eason. And, it was him and Luka kind of crowded on the left corner. It was bad spacing, and Dwight was kind of he like walked off to the side, and Luka, to get his 35th point after having 32 up until this point, his last made field goal of the night, he just like casually steps back. Like it kind of looked like he was in shoot around. There's not many opponents in the NBA, and I'm not trying to write off the Houston Rockets as being a sort of terrible team or anything like that, right? Because any NBA team is much more competent than any college team, more so than anybody has any sort of idea of. And that's one of my sort of ticks, is when people call professional athletes bad. Like obviously, you can comparatively rank them against each other and tier off certain guys. Like that's more than fair. Like I'm not, you would never make an argument that like Daishawn Nix on the Rockets not is near as good as Luka, right? But Daishawn Nix is exponentially closer to Luka than the common guy in the street is to Daishawn Nix, right? So, from that standpoint, the Rockets really just I'm kind of running out of words to describe like how sort of atrocious their defensive effort was tonight, but they just had no answers for the Mavericks. And it honestly seemed like the Mavericks were not even putting forth their best foot in terms of the variety of the offense that was being drawn up, in terms of what the Mavericks were doing. I mean, it was kind of like just, hand the ball to Tim, Luka, Christian Wood, or Dinwiddie and let them shoot over somebody or get to the rack. And when the Mavericks did run actions, they were wildly successful in them. I believe there was one point in like the third quarter where Dinwiddie was able to just throw an easy lob to Christian Wood after the Mavericks were able to really just attack off one closeout and break the Rockets man-to-man defense on just one time, and the Rockets were never able to recover. And it kind of seemed like if the Mavericks were just able to break the defense one time, if they were able to just attack off of a closeout successfully, get a guy on their hip in the pick and roll, if Luka or Dinwiddie were the primary ball handler, in C Wood's case, if he was able to get proper position in the paint, like it was just wraps at that point. There was nothing the Rockets could do. So there's a lot of compelling things to get into with this game. We'll definitely keep it a more shorter podcast because it was more so, a good take care of business when there's not like too many negatives to harp on. So obviously I love doing these podcasts more than having to rag on the Mavericks for, an hour, like some of the ones that we tend to do over here. But nonetheless, we'll go ahead and get into the whole podcast. But first, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, so getting into this one here, at the start of the first quarter, you could definitely tell that the Mavericks' lack of defensive variety was hurting them a few times. They opted to play a zone throughout large stretches in that first half because, of how injury riddled they are right now. And their zone definitely, I think, limited the Rockets' ability to really get things going on the perimeter. I thought the Mavericks were quick to recover in terms of limiting the amount of threes the Rockets were taking and all that sort of stuff. But I do think that the Mavericks did suffer a lot in that first half, specifically from Jabari Smith Jr., top 3 pick in last year's draft, being able to get to the middle of the zones. He was doing a really good job just getting to his spot and at that 6'10", 6'11" frame, just being able to really shoot over anybody that was guarding him. And that did give the Mavericks some issues in that first half, but it was still like a wire-to-wire win for the Mavericks. They didn't suffer so heavily as to, them ever really losing control of this game. But I will say in that first or second quarter, you could obviously see that they had a few issues in terms of finding a counter to Jabari Smith Jr. and his offense, because he was doing a really good job just getting into that painted area, whether he caught the ball at the elbow or the nail, just shooting over guys. And he definitely slowed down in a big way in that second half. He wasn't making as many shots, of course, but nonetheless, it was the Mavericks, still were able to come out of the first quarter with a solid lead. Luka was just effortlessly kind of getting into the paint. It almost seemed as like this was one of those games that he could just pick to pass more, right? Anytime he has a game where he just chooses to do a certain thing, that's how you know he's completely in his bag and there's really no stopping him because he had like 13 assists tonight and, a lot of them were just pinpoint, like flashy passes. This is almost like he was making a statement. Like those type of games, anytime you can get that out of Luka, you typically are winning in a pretty comfortable fashion. And that was very emblematic tonight. So, barring Jabari Smith Jr.'s sort of takeoff in that first quarter, we were able to get things going with some Tim Hardaway Jr. threes. He was doing a really good job, shooting them tonight. You kind of see the total inverse of Tim's night versus New York, where he shot the ball atrociously. It typically seems with Tim that, it's just a game-to-game basis with him. He'll shoot good one night, and then the next night he's going to do terribly, and then the cycle repeats. But that's better than him shooting terribly every night like we saw at the beginning of the season. So I have no issues with this. It is what it is, The Mavericks did opt to start Frank Ntilikina in place of Dwight Powell, who they went to last game. Dwight Powell started in tandem with Christian Wood last game versus the Knicks, and what I thought was a pretty a decision that lacked a lot of foresight and by Jason Kidd, and one that was based off of a very small sample size. Well, Dwight Powell and Christian would have played together, but they haven't had any sort of wild or overt success. If you go look at, their offensive and defensive ratings, any of the advanced numbers on their lineups, it's just it's hard to really build a complete well-oiled machine on the offensive end when, you have two guys that are essentially serving the same role. And obviously, you can stick Christian Wood on the perimeter and use Dwight Powell as the primary roller, but then that sort of expedites Christian Wood's skill set away from, the offense, right? And that kind of limits him to only being an isolation scorer and a guy who can catch and shoot from three. So I do think to an extent playing them together is counterintuitive. There are times where the Mavericks have gone to it throughout this stretch since Maxi's been hurt. But I mean, with how thin they are at big men right now, I really don't see why they just don't keep one of them in the game at all times and then the other one on the bench. But I think they did a better job of that tonight. I don't think they got any minutes together at any point in this game. So that was good to see. And, Christian Wood probably would have had like 30 points in this game, if not for getting in foul trouble. But nonetheless, while he had a very, very slow first half in terms of scoring, he ended up finishing with 5 blocks in this game. A lot of them where he was able to switch onto a smaller defender, or was forced to switch onto a smaller defender, and, stayed with his man and was able to block. And he even got a couple where he was just manned up on Şengün and was able to block him. I mean, a guy who's been a really good post player these first 2 years in the league, right? So that was wildly impressive. I thought it was his best defensive effort as a Maverick. Now, keep in mind, of course, it's against this Houston team, a team where he was on last year, and he knows the personnel of them. He probably knows some of these guys' tendencies a little bit better. He honestly should have had 6 blocks, though, because he got called for a foul on Kevin Porter Jr. there in that first half, where he clearly got a block, but the refs decided against it and called a foul for whatever reason. The refereeing tonight was a little spotty, but not in any realm did it affect the trajectory of this game for the Mavericks. But so, I'm never one to complain about the refs, but unless it is like extremely warranted. But I will say that there were a few weird calls, and I thought they were kind of hard on Christian Wood tonight. He got to 5 fouls really quickly. He was kind of put on an island. This is the problem with Christian Wood as your primary defensive center. He has the capabilities, just athletically, not to be I know he's been averaging 2+ blocks in like the past however many games. I think like 10 at this point. He's had a really good defensive stretch, right? And I think he can be a capable defender, at the NBA level, particularly when he gets switched on to smaller guys like threes and fours. He has the foot speed to be able to match up with them. But I just don't put too much stock into it yet. He has been asked to take a load of the burden as a rim protector. I mean, he's playing heavy minutes right now with Maxey out, and they're not getting any of those two big lineups together. Christian Wood has done a phenomenal job, and he's impressed me, as much as I think I could have been impressed by his defense at this point in the season. He seems like he's really understanding the Mavericks defensive system schematically, right? But I don't want to shift the narrative completely into labeling him as the highly coveted rim protector that this team needs, because this team still, make no mistake about it, needs a rim protector. They still do not. There still is a sense of, fortification that they're missing on the back line, right? And it's not a knock on Christian Wood. It's just stylistically, he's about 6'9", 6'10". He has good length, good foot speed, but he's relatively slim in frame. He's done a way better job effort-wise on that side of the ball. I'm not going to negate that whatsoever. And he's doing as good of a job as he can, but I think he's more well-suited as a guy that, has to guard fours at times and can occasionally be that weak side, help side shot blocker, not the guy who you want just, playing drop. And they're not really playing him like that. But that's a guy that I think the Mavericks could sorely use, right? And I think Christian Wood, and I've been on this train, some people would opt for him to only be the lone big. And, I can hear the argument for that, but I honestly think he's best suited playing with another rim protector, because Christian Wood is having to alleviate a lot on the defensive end right now. And it's not hurting his offensive game, surprisingly enough, but have this, if we persist with this for a few more weeks, Maxey's still out with his hamstring tear. Who knows when that actually starts to catch up to him, right? So if the Mavericks could, in any sort of fashion, swing a trade for a rim protector at any point this season, I still think that's one of the three most needed things, in tandem with another ball handler and another 3-and-D wing who has a little bit of creation to him, not a guy who's limited by his one-dimensionality like some of the guys on the Mavericks in terms of Dorian and Reggie. Oh, that's another good point. I completely forgot to mention that, obviously off topic as heck right here, but Reggie did not play tonight. He was out with a non-COVID illness, so I don't think that's something that will be something that keeps him out a really long time. But, that was obviously a reason that Frank started tonight. So, back to the Christian Wood argument, though, he still, I think, would be served best defensively if he's able to get some of that pressure of him having to be the lone big man on the floor alleviated from him, and pairing him with another really good rim protector. And then you have Maxey off the bench to mediate things, be that switchable big who can be a rim protector, but also switch on the guards. That's the idealistic defensive big man rotation for the Mavericks. Because, in a game against the Rockets, of course, Şengün is not the biggest guy either. He's 6'9". He's a solid, post player and what have you, but he's no Jokic, he's no Embiid. Obviously, there's a lot of, more mobile and bigger bigs. Well, mobile was not the word I was really pining for, but there's a lot more bigs that have a more of a sense of a diversification to their game and can do a lot more things offensively and open up things, whether that's stretching the floor, whether that's, being able to furbish themselves inside and really create havoc. I'm not saying that there's a ton of Jokic's and Embiid's on every team, but I do think that there are going to be bigger presences. Oh my God, I don't know if that's a word that's applicable. I just don't think I can properly enunciate that. I don't here. Rather, I don't think that there is going to, there are going to be other bigs that have more of a presence. There we go. I completely apologize, guys. There's going to be other bigs that have more of a presence in the paint, and Christian Wood, that we've seen him at time and time again this season, not be able to guard as effectively. Not really an indictment upon him, but I mean, you look at the game the other night versus the Knicks, like Mitchell Robinson, I mean, gave him the work, and I mean, he's just slightly bigger than him. So the Mavericks, make no mistake about it, still need a guy that can take that pressure off Christian Wood. Whether they find it is a different story. Who knows if they even have the assets to go get it. But it's either, you kind of play the waiting game for Maxey, but I think even if when Maxey returns, you still want a guy like that, because JaVale McGee clearly was not that guy. I mean, even in garbage time, JaVale McGee, he had this like drop step reverse dunk that was kind of cool, but the previous possession, he literally caught the ball and did not have any sense of where he was on the floor, and just flipped the shot up behind his back, and it just slammed off the backboard, and he was like wide open. He was backpedaling. He just wasn't able to catch himself. But the JaVale McGee experiment is, to say the least, failed quite drastically this year, right? And the Mavericks are still, working to try and find that guy, because at the moment that's probably one of the more pressing needs for this team, because it gets that paint protection, gets experience. We see the flaws in this Mavericks team in terms of their, lack of rim protection, especially against other teams, amplified even more so. And obviously the idealistic big in this sense would be a guy who's switchable on the perimeter, but can also protect the paint. Not, when it just shows pure Brook Lopez drop bigs, if we're a Robert Williams or a Miles Turner, guys like that are in that sort of echelon, but those guys are hard to get. And I don't know if the Mavericks are, I'm not saying Robert Williams up for trade, of course. Obviously, Miles Turner has been on the trade block in the last 2 years perpetually. But do the Mavericks have the assets to be able to get one of those guys? Is a narrative we're going to see going forward. We'll have to see, because it's an honest to God question that we really don't know right now, right? But I felt the need to kind of cover the discussion there while still recognizing that Christian Wood had a really good defensive game tonight. He had 5 blocks, and it was the best defensive game he's played this season, no doubt about it. And if he was playing against the Houston Rockets every game, if the Mavericks played against the Houston Rockets every game, I honestly think Christian Wood would be probably the best defensive center in the league. Outside of that, we'll get into everybody, of course. Don't want to run this too long. But like I said, the Mavericks just had a really easy go at it in this game. They had 25 fast break points, I believe. I could be missing the mark on that. It could be a little more, but that's what I remember hearing on the broadcast before it got to garbage time. And I don't know if they got any more than that. The Mavericks were off long misses and off any steals, because this Rockets team did have a few stoppy turnovers. They're young and naive, and they really will just throw the ball away at times, which is or travel or any of that sort of stuff, which is obviously it takes a lot of a burden off of you as a defense when you're able to get get a quick breath of air, things like that. And McKinley Wright, who actually played long stretches in this game, only had 2 points, but he was quite the pest. He did a really good job of pushing the ball. Obviously, I already talked about Luka with those outlet passes in the intro, and the Mavericks were just getting down transition, making it snappy. Obviously they're ranked 29th in transition in the NBA, but they did a good job, pushing the tempo. Dinwiddie was getting out there. Davis was running the floor. Tim was running the floor, and it was a sight for sore eyes. And I mean, it just seemed like if the Mavericks could just do this more, at least against bad teams, because getting out in transition alleviates so much in terms of the energy that you have to expel on the offensive end. And I really think it could just aid some of their problems to an extent, in these games where they end up getting caught by a team that's worse than them because they're too tired on the second night of a back-to-back. If you can just get after it off the jump, try make it a point to run a little more in the first half, things of that nature. That's something I think that could build well for this team a little bit better. I'm not saying that they're going to ever get to the top of the league in transition. They really don't have the personnel for that, just in terms of the heliocentric play style with Luka and how good he is in the half court. But, Luka, if he's in the best stamina and shape he's been in his life right now, or at least in his NBA career, right? And by no means does that mean that he comparatively is in as good of a shape as some of these guys who are just constantly pushing, like a Trae Young or a Jason Tatum or some of these stars that are just constantly on the fast break. But I think he could serve to get it out and transition a little more. I know he's taking an insane burden right now, but I think Luka still could get the ball out a little more, right? And we saw that tonight, and it was a sight for sore eyes because it's something that, I mean, it was the most fast break points we've had this season with 25. And it's something that really just opened up the game and made everything easier for the Mavericks. To harp on Luka a little bit more, I mean, everything just looked so effortlessly for him tonight, right? He had like 12 rebounds, all of which were just like complete snatches. He does such a good job. I mean, we talked about this in the last podcast of positioning himself and putting himself, using his body accordingly on some of these rebounds. He's not soaring over guys for rebounds. I think that's what makes this the most impressive. Like a lot of these like high end rebound guys just have this sheer size and athleticism, i.e. Embiid, to just be able to go over the top of you and grab anything they want, like Giannis. But Luka does a great job boxing out. I'm not saying those guys don't, but that's the fact that he's getting over 10 rebounds a game doing this, being the best rebounder on this team. Obviously a team that's thin in the front court right now, but that's very impressive to me. And I mean, offensively, like he operated out of the post tonight, of course, in the pick and roll with Dwight and Christian Wood, where he was able to find them multiple times. Şengün could not, no discredit to Şengün, but there was just no chance of him being able to, properly cover a pick and roll with Luka and Christian Wood or Luka and Dwight Powell. Like once that started catalyzing in the second and third quarter, in the first quarter, even for Dwight Powell had, a really good game in this one. He ran the floor well. He did a good job as a rim runner, and that's really all you can ask of him. He's quietly had a really, he's had a solid stretch here. It's just he hasn't really been scoring. I say solid. He hasn't done anything like particularly bad, barring a few really atrocious defensive games. He was at least holding his own when the Mavericks went to zone in this game, and luckily, he was able to be a benefactor of a lot of Luka passes on the other end. A couple lobs, and McKinley Wright found him once in transition for an and one. So it was a solid little game from Dwight. And anytime that you can get like over 10 points from Dwight, and that automatically boosts your win chances by a large margin, because that's not something that you see every game. That's something that the Mavericks probably seldom get from him, right? And otherwise, Christian Wood, like I said, I already talked about his defensive game. Offensively, he did, in the first half, he was severely hampered by foul trouble. He made like 1 3, but they just weren't really going to him. In the second quarter, he just started shooting the lights out. He had I believe 4 threes in this game. Let's see. He actually only got accredited for 4 blocks, but that makes more sense. I thought a couple of them were kind of stretches anyways. Yeah, he made 5 threes in this game, and he really kind of seemed like he was giving the business to the Rockets. And anytime he got an isolation possession, if he was posted up at the elbow or that mid-range area in between the, baseline and the corner 3-point line, he would just go to work. And there, once, to just point out how effortless it was for him. It just seemed like regardless of how many guys the Rockets stocked the paint up with, whether it be Tari Eason, KJ Martin, there was nothing they could really do. Şengün's not your idealistic defensive big man, and they're just really thin at that position. Garuba is this sort of versatile chess piece that kind of is a center and kind of not. I do enjoy his game, though. He always seems to torch us for some reason, and then just gets no playing time against other teams, apparently, which is really funny. But from that perspective, I did think that it was just a really effortless night. Spencer Dinwiddie in this game, we look at him. He had 3 threes tonight, a lot of which were in transition. He was just pulling up or off a pass. He would just, kind of come up and shoot it. 15 points, 6 assists. He did a really good job taking what the defense gave him in this one. He was not overtly aggressive. We've seen kind of a deviation from him really being a secondary ball handler these last couple games. That's not going to be something that continues, I think. But I think Luka's in such God mode right now that, whatever everybody else does around him in terms of ball handling is basically complimentary. Luka is basically taking the ball and doing something with it every possession versus earlier in the season, we saw him defer to Spencer. So, at times and for stretches, not like throughout the whole game. But I think that that's going to be something that while we may see a few more games in a row, like surely, Luka is going to need some of that pressure alleviated from him. So it's been nice to see how the Mavericks have kind of used the secondary ball handler position by committee, by, throwing in Kemba in spurts and him doing some nice things to mix it up in terms of the way he's able to penetrate and kick and wrap it around to guys in the dunker spot. Getting some McKinley Wright minutes, of course, giving him the ball. And, of course, Spencer, who it seems game to game, depending on how gaudy Luka is going off in whatever game, it kind of depends on how much Spencer is going to really furbish himself in terms of trying to handle the ball and create for himself and others. But nonetheless, I mean, Spencer's a great ball mover. I always say this about him, like even if he's not handling the ball himself, he always keeps swinging it. And he always does a really good job of, when those pick and roll opportunities are presented, when he's having to run it in the second unit, trying to capitalize upon them. I think we've seen a progression from him from being a pretty bad lob passer to at least a competent one. He's hasn't had as many bad turnovers as early in the season, which has been nice to see. I'm still not labeling him as like this any sort of insanely good passer or anything like that, but it's been quite the revelation to see that at least. Tim Hardaway Jr., I talked about, had a good shooting night, got out in transition. Good for him. I thought the Mavericks, in terms of just their team defensive by committee, were really good tonight. As when they played zone, just their anticipation. They jumped the gun on a few steals that I was really shocked by and got out in transition. Frank did a good job when he had to guard Jalen Green in that first half. McKinley Wright was a huge pass. He ran around, for only being a 5'11", that's literally my height. The guy has his foot speed is unmatched on the defensive end, and his lateral quickness to be able to stay in front of guys and contest nonetheless. There was even like one time where Bruno Fernando at the end of the game went up for a dunk, and I think McKinley Wright got called for a foul, but he almost got a piece of the ball from behind. I think he did. He basically blocked the shot. He may have got some arm as well, but he tries his ass off on the defensive end, and you can really see it, how beneficial that is for the Mavericks to have a guy at the point of attack that can, he has a good wingspan for his height and really just gets after it tenaciously. Obviously there are times where he may get shot over, but overall, I think he is a plus defender despite his size, which you really just can't say out of many guys that height in the NBA. It's wildly impressive to me to some of the things he's been able to do. He didn't get too much of an opportunity to handle the ball tonight, and he made like one in garbage time. But in terms of his defense, I think that could be something that gets him on the floor. Outside of that, in terms of guys, we already talked about Dwight, talked about Tim, talked about Spencer, talked about C. Wood, talked about Luka. Frank played 18 minutes in this game. He he didn't have a ton of creation opportunities, but he did have like a cool no-look pass to Tim in the corner. It was a really Frank had his typical, I'm not going to be disruptive to the game at all. I'm just going to go with the flow on offense and play good defense game. And that's really all I can ask for. I'd like to see Frank start to knock down a little more of his threes. He's kind of treading through a pretty rough shooting stretch quietly here. I don't know how many people have actually caught wind of that or pay attention enough, but he, in his limited opportunities, has not been shooting the ball good. And in a stretch where the Mavericks may actually need to rely on him for the next week or two, which is kind of wild to say, I would hope that he can turn that around a little bit, especially if he's going to be getting some spot starter minutes and things of that nature. But I don't have any complaints like that from him in this game. He did his job. So that was good to see. Kemba got some garbage time minutes. He made 2 threes. I thought he made 2 threes. He only made 1 in garbage time. Davis played throughout stretches in the game, just, due to how thin we are in terms of our rotation right now. He had another kind of like rough shooting go, but he had 2 transition buckets off Luka outlet passes. One was a dunk. One was a reverse layup where KJ Martin was trying to take his head off basically, but Davis was able to adjust nonetheless. So that was good to see. Outside of that, JaVale, I already kind of talked about his little garbage time run where he made like a floater and had a drop step reverse dunk, but still just looked like really. He looked very. I'm not an NBA player tonight, and even in limited time and garbage time, which is really funny. And Jaden Hardy got a little run in garbage time. He got a little run in the second quarter as well. He was definitely off shooting tonight, and he had a few kind of ticky-tacky fouls where he reached in and he got beat off the dribble. We've seen better defensive efforts from him on that end. So that was a little disappointing, but it wasn't anything, wildly egregious or limiting in a sense where I was like, oh, he needs to get off the floor. So, just need to see the continued progression of him. Some games he's going to be really good. Sometimes the decision making simply is not going to be there. He just really didn't have it all tonight in his limited minutes. He has an opportunity to grab some minutes here with everybody out, but it just really takes that one good game for him to furbish himself in the rotation a little bit more, right? But nonetheless, I liked it wasn't anything really obstructive or something that really messed with the game flow at all. And, I hope he gets more PT going forward. He's still an intriguing young prospect and still wildly important to this team's future nonetheless. And, he made a 3 in the fourth quarter. We got a Boban sighting in the fourth quarter, which is great. He made 2 layups over JaVale, funny enough, in the fourth quarter, and the crowd was chanting, which is really good. So anytime you get to see Boban, that's always good to see. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of offensively tonight, the Mavericks did a good job of just making the Rockets defense collapse and operating within the paint. I don't know how many points in the paint the Mavericks had, but they had to have had quite a bit because, I mean, the Mavericks in this game, let me see how many threes they shot because I don't think it was a whole lot. Oh, they shot 45 and made 18. Never mind. Okay, it was a game, though, where is kind of outlandish as this is to say. The Mavericks didn't need to make that many threes to win the game. I thought, like I said, this is more of a defiant win, and I thought the Mavericks really took care of business. I think they could have easily beat this Rockets team if Luka simply served to be more aggressive. He deferred to some step back threes and, rightfully so in a game where he doesn't have to expel all of his energy, right? Especially after that 60-point haymaker the other night, which was just pure insanity. But I think the Mavericks could, if they wanted to play different stylistically in this game specifically, I don't think they have the luxury to do this in that much in all other games just because of the lack of creation and what have you. But I think they could have, they did a good job running in transition, getting into the paint. I think that they could have beat the Rockets more so in that manner if they really wanted to. But it was just a good wire-to-wire win where we shot good and, the Mavericks defensive personnel was obviously hampered severely and all the injuries and everything to Reggie, Josh, Dorian, and Maxey. The Mavericks played good zone and spots, and outside of Jabari Smith Jr., making some mid-range jump shots over some guys in the first quarter. The Mavericks didn't really have a ton of things that I thought were really patchable just based on the personnel that they had out there tonight. Jalen Green, he had 23 points, but none of them, barring maybe a couple baskets where he was able to beat Tim off the dribble because, Tim obviously is, pretty basically an abomination on defense. We all know that. I was just trying to think of a nice way to put that. So I apologize to Tim and everything. But nonetheless, I mean, Jalen Green, he the points that he was getting tonight, they were all tough, step back threes. Same with Kevin Porter Jr. I mean, this Rockets offense just doesn't have any flow to it. This team has no way to alleviate any of the pressure that those guys have to take on because those guys are also very narrow sighted when they get into the lane. They're looking to score, what they're trying to do. And, their inability to furbish themselves as playmakers, I think has been a big thing for Houston fans in terms of their complaints and what they'd like to see those guys develop into more. But that's obviously a work in progress for them. And I do hope the best for them and Steven Silas, even though obviously it is, F the Rockets over here for Steven Silas's sake. I did enjoy his time in Dallas. So I hope that they're able to, I'm sure they will. I mean, they have a very talented young roster, even if the basketball product on the floor does not equate. Um, but that, I mean, you just kind of know what they're going to do every time. I mean, and talent will win over sometimes. Like Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. have made some tough shots tonight, but it's just that decision making process where it's like, okay, you could have, dropped it off to Şengün in the pick and roll here instead of waving him off and taking a step back three or trying to do everything yourself and just jump over everybody. Like that sort of stuff is kind of what I'm getting at here in terms of, Jalen Green having 23 points and Kevin Porter Jr. having 17 points respectively. But all of them were just tough buckets that didn't come in a manner that was sort of like you felt like it was productive to winning, if that makes sense, which is harsh to say to an extent, but I do feel as if that was kind of the truth in this game. Otherwise, on the Rockets tonight, let's kind of check them out here. Eric Gordon had a couple buckets, really strong guy, obviously a trade target for every team in the league at this point, any team that's trying to win. Maybe the Mavericks can get on that, but I don't know what the asking price is for him. Having seen him tonight and some of these other games that the Mavericks have played the Rockets, I do think that I would definitely like him on this team, and just having that added veteran presence and another 3-and-D wing with some playmaking ability, because he's kind of a tweener. He's like, in terms of he offers you some pseudo creation ability as well as being a solid defensive guard who can stand still and catch and shoot threes if he needs to. But if the asking price for him right now is a first round pick, which is kind of being tossed around, I don't know how keen I am to that. But I mean, who knows? I don't think I'd be too interested in that, especially I knew he was in his like early 30s, but 34 like is what he turned 34 on Christmas, I believe. Like I just don't know if that's going to be the most applicable option. I know the Rockets scored 114 points tonight, but a lot of them came in that like fourth and third quarter where the Mavericks like completely took their foot off the gas. Christian Wood being in foul trouble, definitely like he kind of just let a lot of guys score at the rim throughout stretches in this game. So, I mean, I don't think it was a bad defensive effort from the Mavericks. I thought they did as good as they could with the personnel that they had by committee, and their offense was able to carry them, and they kind of needed in a game like this. And just based on their personnel, that's just kind of how they have to play. I'm not going to get mad when they're missing as many of their good defenders as they are. Is it going to potentially lead to some losses when this stretch gets tougher here in a couple days? Like definitely. I mean, the Mavericks have a tough stretch, like post January 5th. January 5th, they start playing the Celtics, and next game after that, the Pelicans, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely going to be a compelling narrative going forward. But in a game like this, where you can just outscore your opponent and, you play as good of team defense as you can, I mean, I don't have too many gripes with it, right? In terms of, the Rockets played a plethora of guys off the bench who all contributed in some sort of fashion, in garbage time. Deshaun Nix made a few threes at the end. Bruno Fernando. He's a guy who's like, honestly, I think I would like to see more out of him. He's a really cognizant, like offensive center. He knows what he's doing on the floor, if that makes any sense. He's one of the few guys on that team that has like plays his role to a T and, has a clear agenda when he's out there. But, he does have some defensive limitations. Tari Eason, a guy who I really like, only played 18 minutes tonight. But that first Mavericks versus Rockets game, we saw the versatility of him. Really intriguing young player. He didn't get a ton of clock tonight, but, solid game from him, whatever. Didn't shoot too much, 3 for 7 from the field. Ty Washington Jr. played a lot more in that game where Luka had 50. Got a little bit of clock tonight, made a 3. Usman Garuba, like I said, he was an intriguing guy, really good rebounder, guy who can defend, 2 through 5 pretty well, has the measurables and, defensive intensity that scouts kind of salivate out over. I mean, this was a guy when he was coming out of the draft. I mean, a lot of guys were raving about him. He kind of has yet to furbish himself in the NBA because of how limited he is on offense. He's kind of limited to like being a short roller and that little flip shot, something that like a guy like Rashawn Holmes made a living off of. And Rashawn Holmes doesn't have the versatility that Usman Garuba has I mean, if Usman Garuba, he made a 3 in this game, and it was only his 9th of the year, I believe. He can figure it out shooting wise. He's going to be a good player one day. I truly believe that. I think there's a lot to be unlocked with this guy, in my opinion. I apologize, guys. My throat's just dry right now. Not sick like last week on the podcast. But obviously this Rockets team, Şengün, he had a solid game tonight, but I think Christian Wood earnestly outworked him in this game, which was quite the revelation because Şengün had a much better offensive game that first time the Mavericks played the Rockets. Not the last game, but the first time. And, was really giving the business. And we saw the progression of Christian Wood defensively to where he's basically tiered himself off from probably a, average or on some nights minus defender to obviously not an A plus, like gaudy or like penultimate rim protector, but he's a guy who is not a complete liability on defense. And we saw that with him limiting Şengün to 11 points tonight. Şengün also got in foul trouble and only played 16 minutes, but that was in large part to how much of an offensive force Christian Wood was on the other end. And, the pressure that the Mavericks were able to put on the rim. So there's that as well. The Rockets have a lot of intriguing young players, and they're going to be really good one day, but this team is just so unsynchronized defensively, and they just have so much issues that can only be fixed with time and playing together and probably one or two more, hits in the draft. Like so many of their problems aren't like this team, like athletically should be a lot better defensively than they are just in terms of like their personnel, but they're not because they, it's a really young team and their communication just isn't where it needs to be. Their rotations and their, inability to not, preemptively close out on guys, things of that nature. Like they're just going to struggle more so with that just because of their youth. And it is what it is, but it's a great take care of business win for the Mavericks. And they did what they need to do, got out in transition, had a fun game. Luka continues his insane recent stretch where I think in the last like 5 games, he's averaging 40 points and like 11 and 10, like just obscure stuff. And I mean, this is what he's having to do with the amount of injuries we have right now. The Mavericks play the Spurs on New Year's Eve. We're probably going to have to do a podcast the day after that because me and Jaron both have plans that night. But if anything changes, we'll let you guys know. We'll do it. If there's any way possible we can do a podcast that night, we will. But just don't look forward to it. But it was quite the relief that the Mavericks were, like I said, I'll repeat myself for the 8th time. But it was just a good relief, good feel-good win on a Friday. Is it Friday? Or no, okay, it's Thursday. It's Friday right now as I'm recording this on a Thursday night. And I was glad that the Mavericks just took care of business in this game. And, we had, I think, 5 guys in double figures. Like, that's all you can ask for, especially in a game where as injury riddled as we are, in a game that could have been a trap game after a historic performance from Luka. Like, what more can you ask for, right? This was a solid and fun win. And that's really all I got. I mean, it was and I mean, for the Mavericks to be on a 5-game win streak amidst how they've played in some of this games is insane to me. We'll see if they can continue it against another kind of trap game on New Year's Eve, another like 6:00 start time in San Antonio. Let's see how that goes, right? I think that this, the Mavericks are due at some point. You can only play so good for so long, especially with how injury riddled the Mavericks are. But I mean, the way Luka's playing right now, I mean, I'm not going to say it makes us unbeatable because we've had, a pretty weak strength of schedule in this stretch, but it gives you a chance in any game, and that's for sure. So regardless if we come out flat, as long as Luka continues what he's playing right now, the Mavericks aren't really playing a ton of back-to-backs. I mean, yes, he's expelling a lot of energy, but at least he's getting a day in between games. Who knows what can happen, right? Maybe the Mavericks make it 6 in a row. I mean, just from a, on paper perspective, they should obviously beat the Spurs, but it is getting to that point where it's like, oh, when are the injuries going to catch up to them? So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, but excited to watch that one. Excited for the Mavericks to win 5 in a row. I wouldn't, go as far to say that they're like figuring it out this season yet, because not everybody's back. And like I said, the strength of schedule is really weak right now. But I will say that the Mavericks are in a much better place than they were 2 weeks ago, where I think we were looking at doomsday scenarios. Now we're at least in the territory where it's like, okay, we've accepted our mediocrity, and we're, as long as we can just get out of the play and get to that 60 territory, let's get it right. And I don't want to get too big picture here, but that's kind of something we'll probably look at here as we actually get to the definitive halfway point in the season. We're like 41 games through. Like, big picture wise, what is this Mavericks team doing? Like, how much is going to, getting to the second round this year really doing for them, getting out of the play-in tournament? Like, how much does it bolster this team? Things of that nature. It's a provocative discussion to have. Just the general direction, the amount of flexibility this team has. We'll be getting into that in a few games, but I want to stray away from this right now and just enjoy this win, right? So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the podcast. Follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. For those of you listening on YouTube, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment anything down below. As a matter of fact, if you want to comment something this game, comment how many points you think Luka is going to have in the next game. Do you think he's going to get above 30 points? Do you think he's going to continue this streak? He's averaging 33.6 points right now. Maybe 33.7 after this game. I'd have to check, but Embiid's at 33.7. So Luka is almost averaging the most in the league. Do you think he continues this wild stretch and has, either another triple double or 30 points? Comment down below if you think he'll get either of those. And if you guys are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast platform, make sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating, or hit us up on Twitter or whatever. We appreciate you guys listening, getting this far into the podcast. Stay tuned. We'll be back probably New Year's Day to cover that Spurs game. Unfortunately, because we can't get it out that night, just due to the fact that we're both busy on New Year's Eve. It's not the most favorable time. The Mavericks seem like, I do like the fact that the Mavericks are getting scheduled on holidays and they're all cool, and national media gives us like 1% more attention because of Luka now, and we play on Christmas and New Year's Eve, but it's not too convenient for plans that you have to structure around it. But nonetheless, we'll get it covered the next day at the very worst. And barring that, we don't have Jaron to give you guys the bye today, but we do have me to give you the peace out. So we will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out and stay solid out there.